the Rock and Roll Unravel Show. I'm Derek Shalmadine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unravel Show. Now, 2020 celebrates the 50th anniversaries of the events of 1970. And to kick us off, we're going to take a look at three really interesting 1970 gigs. Well, the first one's Led Zeppelin on the 28th of February. They actually performed as the Knobs at the KB Hallen Concert Hall in Copenhagen, Denmark. And the reason for that was that Eva von Zeppelin, one of the descendants of the airship dynasty, threatened to sue Led Zeppelin if they performed in her home country using her family's name without permission. Anyway, to avoid complications, Led Zeppelin decided they'd bill themselves as the Knobs. And on the 3rd of April, journalists were flown over to America for a Brinsley Schwarz concert to see the band in concert at New York's Fillmore East. And it became known as one of the most overhyped British press debut gigs ever. Now, they were supporting headliners Quicksilver Messenger Service, and the lineup also included Van Morrison and folk singer Tom Paxton. But sadly, the British journalists were deeply unimpressed with the pub rock band, and they never really recovered from the experience, and the band became synonymous with rock hype. Named after the lead guitarist Brinsley Schwarz, the band evolved from Kippington Lodge and became one of the pioneers of the early 70s British pub rock scene. The lineup itself included vocalist and songwriter Nick Lowe. And for our last gig, look at what's one of the most famous gigs of all time, really, The Who, live at Leeds. And that was on the 14th of February, when they recorded the concert at Leeds University. The album was nearly live at Hull. They had a concert in Hull at the City Hall the following night. That was also recorded, but sound problems meant that a lot of the material wasn't really usable for inclusion on a live album. Now, Live at Leeds was released with memorabilia inserts in a sort of mock bootleg sleeve, and that was very similar to the sleeve of the Rolling Stones album Liver Than You'll Ever Be. Now, the original vinyl album only contained 6 songs, and the performance of Tommy that night had to wait for a release until 2001, when the 2-CD deluxe edition hit the streets. But Leeds Civic Trust were very keen on the concert, and they awarded a blue plaque to the venue with the inscription, and I quote, "Live at Leeds, the University Refectory is a legendary concert venue. The Who's performance here on the 14th of February 1970 was recorded and released as Live at Leeds, the most celebrated live album of its generation." When the CD of Live at Leeds was released, it had 14 tracks. And extra tracks included Fortune Teller, A Quick One While He's Away, I'm a Boy, Amazing Journey. But the original vinyl album, as I mentioned earlier, just had 6 tracks, 3 originals, Substitute My Generation and an awesome version of Magic Bus, and 3 covers. Summertime Blues from Eddie Cochran, that gave him a 1958 hit on both sides of the Atlantic, and Young Man Blues, now that started life as a Mose Allison song simply called Blues, and he put that out in 1957 as part of his Backcountry Suite. And of course, Shakin' All Over, a number 1 in 1960 for Johnny Kidd and the Pirates. In fact, that was Johnny Kidd's only UK number 1. But this is the Who's take on that Johnny Kidd classic, Shakin' All Over. After dominating the 1960s and becoming the most famous band in the world, the Beatles finally split up in the early part of 1970. They were already going their separate ways by then, On the 27th of January, John Lennon recorded Instant Karma, and he apparently wrote it, recorded it and mixed it all in a single day. The band included George Harrison on guitar, keyboardist Billy Preston, bassist Klaus Voormann and drummer Alan Wight. And this was Lennon's first collaboration with Phil Spector as producer. It was released credited as Lennon Ono with the Plastic Ono Band. It gave John Lennon his third UK hit single and a number 5 in the charts. Well, the Beatles released their last UK single on the 6th of March, and that was Let It Be, coupled with You Know My Name, look up the number, and that was produced by George Martin. And the lyric in Let It Be, Mother Mary, actually refers to Paul's mother, and the B-side featured Rolling Stones' Brian Jones on saxophone. That was a return to his trad jazz roots. But that wasn't their last single in America. Their swan song there came in the May when they released Long and Winding Road, coupled with For You Blue. But really the end came about after the Daily Mirror UK newspaper ran with the headline of Paul is quitting the Beatles on the 10th of April 1970. Now this came about because there was a press release that was planned to accompany Paul's debut solo album he was about to release, simply called McCartney. And somehow that found its way prematurely into the press, and the Daily Mirror read between the lines and led with the front page headline, Paul is quitting the Beatles. He'd never actually said he was parting company with the band, but the writing had been on the wall for so long that the inevitable became the reality. Now, relationships in the band were pretty fraught by now. There was a polarisation between Paul and the others, and in early 1969 two factions developed, wanting to employ two different managers. John, George and Ringo wanted New York businessman Alan Klein to rescue things, as things weren't altogether going too well business-wise for the Beatles at that point. But Paul, well, he wanted Linda's father and brother, New York attorneys Lee and John Eastman, for the role. And when the split came, it was seriously acrimonious, with Paul in one camp and the other three in the other. But things hadn't been well for a while. I mean, all three Beatles had announced that they were walking out. Ringo started back in August 68, George Harrison during the Get Back sessions, and in September, John had announced to the others that he was planning to quit the group. Now, the Get Back project started on the 2nd of January 1969. It was very much Paul's idea, and he envisioned a project as an odyssey, filming the recording sessions and having a live concert in a small intimate venue, with the goal of producing an album and a movie of the process of making the album. And the whole recording process was driven by producer Glyn Johns. Get Back was planned as the follow-up to the double album The Beatles, that's also known, probably better known, as the White Album. Now, Glyn Johns did produce a finished or near-finished version of the Get Back album, but the trouble was that the relationship between the various members of the Beatles was so bad that they could never agree on the mixes or a final version, so it was never released, although they did manage to agree in the autumn of 69, because that was when they finished off the Abbey Road album, and that was released. So technically Abbey Road was their last recorded album. But the Let It Be album transpired in the March of 1970, bearing in mind it had started out in the January of 1969, but it was in the March of 70 that Phil Spector was brought in to finish the Get Back album, and that's when it became Let It Be. And it was the 23rd of May when Let It Be entered the UK charts. And in a wonderful stroke of irony, there's one track on the album, Let It Be, that's credited to all four Beatles. So the writing credit for Dig It goes to Lennon, McCartney, Starkey and Harrison, which I think is one of the great ironies in the Beatles. And it did emerge, as Paul envisaged, as an album accompanied by a movie of the sort of recording process of the album. And on the 20th of May, the Let It Be movie was premiered in Britain, and that opened simultaneously in Liverpool and London, but none of the Beatles turned up to see it. And that was very much really marked the end of the Beatles, although they've never really gone away. In 1970, they all produced solo albums. On April the 17th, Paul McCartney released his McCartney album, and about a week later, Ringo Starr released his first solo album, Sentimental Journey. Now, the other two had previously released albums in their own names, but you wouldn't really describe them as true solo albums. They came for George Harrison in the November, when he released All Things Must Pass, and in the December, John Lennon's first real solo album came out, Plastic Ono Band. Now, over the years, various combinations of the Fab Four have performed together, but they've never again performed as the Beatles. And that's despite an offer of $30 million from American promoter Bill Sargent in 1976. Paul was never happy with John's decision to bring in Phil Spector to complete the Get Back album and turn it into what became their swan song, Let It Be. Paul felt that the album was very overproduced, and in 2003 he set this to rights when he released his own cut-back version of the album, Let It Be Naked. And this is the title track from what Paul thought the album should sound like. And this is Let It Be Naked. You're listening to Derek Shelmadine and the Rock and Roll Unraveled show. Now, before continuing with the story, there's an opportunity to win a copy of my book. That's a signed copy of Rock and Roll Unraveled. Every month there's a single question competition in conjunction with the Rock and Roll Unraveled show. For the current quiz, just check out my homepage on rockandrollunraveled.com. That's 2 L's for Unraveled. Follow the link to the quiz at the top of the page. Send me the answer and I'll send you a signed copy of Rock and Roll Unraveled to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. Now, Rock and Roll Unraveled tells the story of rock and roll from its roots to mid-1970s punk, and Record Collector magazine review described the book as comprehensive and invaluable. Thank you very much, Record Collector. Well, good luck with the competition, and meanwhile, back at the plot. We're looking at the awesome year that was 1970. We might have just heard about the end of the Beatles, but it marked the dawn of a bunch of new rock genres, heavy metal, space rock, glam, and others as well. We're just going to look at those three. Well, with space rock, Hawkwind were one of the pioneers, and they played their first gig on the 29th of August 1969, but it was a simple affair. They were calling themselves Group X, and it was a 20-minute jam at All Saints Hall, Notting Hill, but the lineup did include long-time member Dave Brock. They changed their name to Hawkwind shortly after that particular gig and released their first album, simply called Hawkwind, about a year later, in the August of 1970. It was produced by Dick Taylor, who'd recently parted company with the Pretty Things, but it was still a couple of years before they had their first UK hit single, and that was with Silver Machine. Now, the band went through multiple lineup changes during its journey into the 21st century, but one constant on this epic musical voyage was the founding member, guitarist, singer and songwriter Dave Brock. But it's worth mentioning a couple of other people who passed through the ranks on the journey there. Bassist Lemmy, he joined them in 1972. He started with their third album, Do Re Mi Fa Sol Latido, and left after their sixth album, Warrior on the Edge of Time. He actually left because he was sacked on the 18th of May 1975 after a contretemps with some Canadian officials at the customs and the border with America. But it wasn't all bad news, because Lenny went on to form Motorhead. And a guy that spent just one album with them was Ginger Baker, the ex-Cream and Blind Faith drummer. He was with them for their 1980 album, Levitation. And glam rock appeared in 1970 as well. Now, Mark Bolan had beavered away throughout the 1960s with very little success. That really started to come with Tyrannosaurus Rex. And they made their debut at Middle Earth Club in London on the 23rd of September 1967. They were a psychedelic folk duo, and it was Mark Bolan and percussionist Steve Peregrine Took. Now, initially the pair, well, they weren't very popular, weren't very well received at all, but they found a champion in legendary DJ John Peel, and with his help, they soon gathered quite a strong underground following. They had their first hit single in April of 1968 with Deborah, written by Mark Bolan, produced by Tony Visconti. It gave them a number 34, and then they had a couple more minor hits as Tyrannosaurus Rex, and they decided to extend beyond the duo and shorten the name to T-Rex. And on the 2nd of October 1970 they released their first single as T-Rex, Ride a White Swan, and again that was written by Mark Bolan and produced by Tony Visconti. Well, the B-side's interesting. It was a couple of songs, Summertime Blues and Is It Summer? Now, Summertime Blues might have been there because urban legend has it that Mark Feld, a young Mark Bolan, carried Eddie Cochran's guitar to his car while it was waiting outside the Hackney Empire on that fateful last tour of Eddie Cochran's in 1960. And that was his first UK hit single, and that was very much the dawn of British glam rock, but heavy metal. I'm still going strong today. I mean, that arrived in 1970, and Black Sabbath were very much one of the pioneers of that particular genre. Now, they had their first gig as Black Sabbath on the 27th of September 1969, and that was at the Drill Hall in Dumfries, Scotland, a very unlikely setting for the beginnings of heavy metal. They had previously been called Earth, but they changed their name to avoid confusion with another band called Earth. And the inspiration for Black Sabbath as a band name came from the title of 1963 Boris Karloff movie. As you'd expect, Black Sabbath had its roots in blues music. In 1968, bass player Terry Geezer Butler, guitarist Tony Iommi, vocalist Ozzy Osbourne and drummer Bill Ward hooked up with a slide guitarist and keyboard player and formed a six-piece Polka Tulk blues band. Now, Ozzy Osbourne and Geezer Butler had actually joined Polka Tulk from another band called Rare Breed. They went through some name changes, dropped the slide guitarist and keyboard guy, and became the four-piece Earth. Now, on the 13th of February 1970, they released their first album, simply called Black Sabbath. It was on the Vertigo Swirl label, for any record collectors out there. And Rolling Stone magazine rates it as number 5 on their list of best 100 metal albums. And apparently the album was reputedly recorded in a single day. And part of the distinctive sound of Black Sabbath comes from Tony Iommi, the guitar player. And his style developed after he lost a couple of fingertips in an industrial accident early on in his career. But on the 7th of August 1970, they released Paranoid, taken from their second album of the same name. And it was their first UK hit single. Gave them a number 4. And that's the dawn of heavy metal, and this is Black Sabbath with Paranoid. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with a Rock and Roll Unravel show, and we're taking a look at the 50th anniversaries of some of 1970s landmarks. An awful lot of the bands we're talking about today are actually on tour, and to check out the latest info for everybody I mention in the show, just go for my website, rockandrollunraveled.com. That's unravelled with 2 L's. And at the top you'll see 1960s, 70s artists touring now. And if they're still alive, take it from me, you'll find these guys out on the road. Now, our next anniversaries are some epic festivals from 1970. You might not be familiar with our first festival, but it sounded like a whole lot of fun. And that's the Canadian Festival Express, from the 27th of June to the 4th of July. And they used the train to carry the performers from Toronto to events in Winnipeg and Calgary. And it opened with a couple of days at Toronto CNE Stadium, and the lineup was awesome. Included Janis, Joplin, Grateful Dead, The Band, Delaney and Bonnie, 10 Years After, Traffic Mountain, and the Flying Burrito Brothers. But it hadn't all gone that smoothly in the run-up to the festival. There was a very, very vocal group of locals who believed that they were being ripped off. They believed that the festival should be free. One of the organisations leading the discontent was the M4M, the May the 4th movement. That was a group set up to commemorate the 4 students who were shot dead at Kent State University during an anti-Vietnam War demonstration there. And in order to placate this discontent, the Grateful Dead organised a free concert nearby. The bands boarded the train after the Toronto gig and spent 5 days partying with a stop-off for the Winnipeg concert, and they arrived in Calgary for the final gig on the 4th of July. The whole event was taped by a film crew, but the problems at the time meant that it was nearly 35 years before the tour movie saw the light of day. Now, you'll definitely have heard of the next festival, and that was Glastonbury. The first ever Glastonbury festival was held on the 19th and 20th of September. And it was inspired by the Bath Blues Festival when farmer Michael Eavis went to see this and then decided to help out with his own farm's expenses by hosting his own pop, folk and blues festival, as he called it, at Worthy Farm, Pilton, Somerset. And the performers there included Mark Bolan, Quintessence, Al Stewart, Keith Christmas, Stackridge, Amazing Blondell and Jethro Tull's Ian Anderson. Well, it was quite a modest affair, attended by about 1,500 people at £1 a time, and the poster promised, and I quote, "All food at fair prices, ox roast, all farms milk free." And the third of our festivals, the 1970 Isle of Wight Festival. It was billed as August the 26th to the 30th, but the main music programme started on Friday the 28th, and the lineup of this festival was awesome. It included The Doors, The Who, Hendrix, Joan Baez, 10 Years After, John Sebastian, Jethro Tull, Sly and the Family Stone, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Leonard Cohen, and a bunch of other people. Now, over 500,000 people were at the gig, and it's probably one of the greatest festivals of all time. I mean, Jimi Hendrix gave one of his last performances. The Who still had drummer Keith Moon. The Doors were still fronted by Jim Morrison. Emerson, Lake and Palmer had played a warm-up gig in Plymouth a couple of days earlier, but this was their main debut, and their set included their take on Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. John Sebastian gave a great long solo performance in the afternoon, and hearing that Zal Janowski was in the crowd, it's his old buddy from Loving Spoonful, he called out to join him on stage, and he did. Now, on the Saturday night, several thousand fans stayed in front of the stage and refused to move back to the camping area. Now, security threatened all kinds of retribution if the crowd stayed, but they stayed put. They even said that Jethro Tull had said that they wouldn't go on if we didn't leave the front of the stage and return to the tents. No one moved. I say we because I was there. I was sitting in front of the stage that night, which is why I know this festival was absolutely awesome. Anyway, when Jethro Tull came out to do their sound check on the Sunday morning, Ian Anderson confirmed they'd never said anything of the sort to the security people, but a good time was had by all. Joan Baez was there. She followed Jimi Hendrix and exclaimed, "How can anyone follow Jimmy?" And there were performances from artists as diverse as Miles Davis and Tiny Tim. Now, one of my favourites from the festival that weekend was 10 Years After, and on their 1970 album What, there was a track recorded live at the Isle of Wight, and it was 10 Years After take on Chuck Berry's 1958 classic, and this is 10 Years After, and this was recorded live at the Isle of Wight. Sweet Little 16. For our last look at 50th anniversaries from 1970, Well, two rock and roll legends who sadly joined the macabre 27 club, i.e. they died at the age of 27. Now, 1970 started very badly for Jimi Hendrix. On the 28th of January, he played a second of just 2 gigs for his ill-fated Band of Gypsies. And that was at the Winter Festival for Peace anti-Vietnam War benefit gig at Madison Square Garden. And after playing just a couple of songs, Who Knows in Earth Blues, there was an altercation between Hendrix and a woman in the audience. And it resulted in Hendrix cutting the performance short and stomping off the stage. Well, the lineup was Hendrix with Billy Cox bass and Buddy Miles drums. They played their debut gig at New York's Fillmore East on the 31st of December. And that was the performance that was released as the live album, Band of Gypsies. Now, the royalties from that album went to former manager Ed Chalpin as part settlement of a deal he'd signed when Chalpin became his manager on the 15th of October 1965. The problem was that when he came over to the UK with Chas Chandler and found international fame, Ed Chalpin was still technically his manager. 25th of April to the 1st of August, he made his final US appearances on the Cry of Love tour. And they were back to being called the Jimi Hendrix Experience, still a trio, still with army buddy Billy Cox, but now reunited with the original Experience drummer, Mitch Mitchell. The end of August, he officially opened his Electric Lady Studios in New York's Greenwich Village. And he had his final UK concert on the 30th of August at the Isle of Wight festival that we just heard all about. Now from there he headed off to Europe for some concerts in Sweden, Denmark and Germany, and he played his last ever concert on the 6th of September at the Love and Peace Festival on the Isle of Furman in Germany. On his return to Britain, Hendrix made his last ever appearance when he jammed with Eric Burdon and War on the 16th of September at Ronnie Scott's Club in London. We played blues for Memphis Slim, and that included Mother Earth and Tobacco Road. And he died less than 2 days later on the 18th of September. Now, Monica Daneman, his girlfriend, found Jimi Hendrix unconscious and unable to rouse him. She called an ambulance to her London flat. The ambulance crew took him to hospital and doctors failed to revive him. The death certificate gave the cause as inhalation of vomit, barbiturate intoxication, and in brackets quinylbarbital, and then interestingly, insufficient evidence of circumstances, open verdict. At the time, Mick Jeffrey was his manager, and Mick Jeffrey reckoned there was only $20,000 in the Hendrix estate. Now, lots of speculation and rumours about Jimi Hendrix's death, murder, suicide, overdose. Those inconsistencies partly arise out of various things, like Monica Daneman kept changing her story. She said that she was with Hendrix when the paramedics arrived. Paramedics reckoned Hendrix was alone. She also said she travelled in the ambulance with Hendrix. Paramedics said she didn't. And in fact, Eric Burdon, who was a big friend of Jimi Hendrix, said that Monica Daneman travelled with him. Eric Burdon was there before the paramedics arrived, and he found the words to The Story of Life. He thought it was a suicide note, but it turned out to be Jimi Hendrix's last composition. Now, an urban myth has it that Mike Jeffrey, his manager, had Hendrix murdered. The rumours that Hendrix was about to terminate his contract, and that Jeffrey had actually taken out a $1 million insurance on Hendrix, and that Jeffrey had mob connections. Now, Hendrix's new studio was reputedly in a part of New York controlled by the mob, and another rumour was that Hendrix had massive amounts of red wine in his lungs and little in his bloodstream, and that apparently is consistent with waterboarding rather than drinking. The murder claim actually was made also by James Tappy Wright and Rod Weinberg in their book Rock Roadie, and it would appear, certainly rumours, that the FBI had Hendrix under surveillance. Well, all very strange. Who knows which of these things is true and which isn't. We'll probably never find out. I mean, Mick Jeffrey died in a mid-air collision over France in 1973, and Monica Damon committed suicide in 1996. So I guess that will always remain a mystery. Well, not so much with Janis Joplin, no controversy there. Sadly, she joined the 27 Club on the 4th of October 1970. She was just finishing off recording her album Pearl. It was when she didn't turn up at the studio for the day's recording that road manager John Cook went off to Janis's hotel and found her sadly dead in a room at the Landmark Hotel Hollywood, California. The certificate of death gave the cause as acute heroin morphine intoxication, injection of overdose. Now, the day before she died, she was actually making some of the final recordings for Pearl. They'd laid down the instrumental backing track for Buried Alive in the Blues, and that was written by Nick Gravenites. And it was included when the album was released, but the track remained as an instrumental. Well, that's it. I've been Derek Shelmadine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unravel show and some of the great 50th anniversaries of 1970. I hope you've enjoyed the show as much as I've in putting the whole thing together. If you're into social media, I'm on Twitter at RNR Unraveled, Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled, and remember you can win a copy of the book Rock and Roll Unraveled. Try out the website rockandrollunraveled.com, and those Unravels are all with 2 L's. Just click on the link to competition. Good luck with the competition, and join me again next time for another look at a little piece of rock and roll unravelled. Now, to play us out from Janis Joplin's final album Pearl, it included a cover of Garnet Mim's 1963 hit Cry Baby. Now, that was written and produced by Burt Burns and Jerry Ragavy under the pseudonyms B. Russell and N. Mead, interestingly enough. But this is Janis Joplin with her awesome version of Cry Baby.